I think we can now move on to describe a little bit about the nature and course of youth offending. I alluded to this earlier, but only about 1 in 5 crimes in Canada are actually committed by youth. So another way of saying this is that 80% of all offending in Canada is perpetrated by adults. The youth crime rate is higher than the crime rate for adults, but in terms of the actual volume of offending in Canada, adults are involved in more offending, yet we see in politics especially there can be this focus on youth crime, that youth crime is out of control, and really if we wanted to reduce crime we also have to be focusing heavily on adults. I mentioned the age crime curve is kind of like a universal fact of criminology, and another universal fact is the idea that a vast majority of all crime perpetrated by youth is accounted for by a very small proportion of all youth offenders. And I use the term youth offenders just because it's quicker to say, but generally speaking, we want to avoid this sort of stigmatizing language by calling someone an offender. We want to use more person-centered language, so we can talk about a person who is experiencing incarceration or a person that's been adjudicated. Some might say, well, why do I need to bother doing this? This all sounds kind of silly. And I think the best argument that I've heard made, and what convinced me to really try and use more person-centered language, is the idea of why would we call someone the thing that we don't want them to become? So if we want someone to stop offending, why would we call them an offender? We're trying to get them to not be that, so why give them that label? What we do know is true is that a very small minority of youth are disproportionately responsible for the majority of all crime. This is what we usually refer to as chronic offending. Another key thing to keep in mind is we saw that the rate of violent offending in Canada for youth has gone down. It's also important to keep in mind that violent offending is typically not very serious. Most youth violence is not like aggravated assault, firearm-related offenses, homicide. It's typically very minor, simple assault. Not to say that assault is suddenly okay, but just to understand that most violence is not serious violence. To put some of this into context, in 2000s, only about 0.2% of all violent offenses by youth were for homicide, whereas 77% of all violent offenses by youth were simple or common assault. We saw some evidence of this earlier, but just to reiterate that youth account for only 40% of all charges for break and enter, about the same amount of charges for arson, and then we can see a lower and lower percent of all crimes that youth are responsible for compared to adults, down to youth being responsible for just 16% of all violent offenses. When youth are committing crime, the type of crime that they're most likely to commit is property crime. And among property crimes, the most common crime type is minor theft, or what we would call theft under $5,000. That's the most common crime type by youth. So it's not as if youth are committing especially serious offenses. That's not to say that youth do not commit serious offenses. When I was doing the interviews in custody, almost all of these youth had histories of violent crime, but they represented less than 1% of the general population. It's very rare for youth in the community to end up in custody. In fact, I think it's about 1 in every 1,000 to 1,500 youth actually end up in custody. So think back to, I went to a very small high school, or only like 90 people in it, but some of the high schools in the Lower Mainland, you're going to have in your grade alone 500 people, 1,000 people, and that means that you might not find a single kid in your grade that actually ended up in a youth custody facility. That's how rare incarceration of youth is in British Columbia. The last lecture in this course will touch on this topic in greater detail, but sadly throughout the years Canada has failed to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in custody. In BC, Indigenous youth represent about 5 to 6% of all youth, yet they represent about 25 to 30% of all youth in custody. And this is a statistic that I do want you to memorize for the exam. There are not many things or many statistics that you need to memorize, but one of them that you do need to memorize is that Indigenous youth account for about 25 to 30% of the court population in British Columbia. In places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it's upwards of 50%. To understand this overrepresentation, we have to go back in time and understand the impact of colonization and Canada's attempted genocide against Indigenous peoples. As I mentioned, we'll talk about that in the last week of class. One of the things I'll just mention now is that there are also concerns currently about the over-policing of marginalized groups, especially Indigenous persons. When it comes to over-policing, I'm not saying that what's happening is that police departments are racist. I'm certainly not ruling that out. I believe, obviously, that structural racism exists. But what can also happen is we can get this vicious circle where policing agencies might target specific areas that have higher crime rates, and so they will send more police officers to focus on those communities. And having more police officers in specific communities increases the likelihood that crime is going to be detected. So the more that we detect crime, the higher the crime rate becomes. Where maybe we just see that the crime rate in one neighborhood is not as high as the crime rate in another neighborhood because police aren't patrolling that other neighborhood as frequently. And so if we look at places like the downtown east side and in East Vancouver, where we might see a more disproportionate representation of Indigenous persons compared to other municipalities in the Lower Mainland, it's the over-policing of these areas that might further continue or perpetuate the cycle of seeing the over-representation of Indigenous persons in custody. In week 2, we took a look at the homicide offense against James Bulger committed by Thompson and Venables, and both of those individuals were under the age of 12 at the time they committed their offense. And in Canada, they would not be held criminally responsible because the age of criminal responsibility in Canada is 12. Some politicians and members of the media have called for Canada to lower the age at which individuals are criminally responsible because of the idea or their belief that young persons are before the age of 12 and they know they cannot be punished for their behavior, and that's why they go out and engage in these types of crimes. The reality is that youth offending by kids less than 12 is extremely rare. When it does happen, about 90% of all such youth are boys. The majority are 10 or 11 years old, so it's not like 8, 7, 6-year-olds are out engaging in criminal behavior. And so only like 13% of individuals under the age of 12 are also under the age of 7. And in most cases, for kids less than 12 engaging in crime, their offenses are very petty in nature. They're not particularly serious. So while I believe that someone under the age of 12 can form mens rea, they know what they're doing and understand that what they're doing is wrong, I'm not sure that lowering the age of criminal responsibility would be very useful in reducing Canada's crime rate. It wouldn't really deter kids from engaging in crime to begin with. When it comes to looking at the typical offense profiles for girls compared to boys, we see some similarities. So for both girls and boys, theft under $5,000 is about the most common crime types. And then we can see things like break-and-enters and sort of property damages also being a little bit more common. Here's something that I think is interesting. When we look at girls, and this is more historical, I don't know if this is going to be true today, but when we looked at girls historically, their violent charges tended to occur early in adolescence, whereas for boys, we saw that their violent charges tend to occur in later adolescence. And I think the reason for this has to do with patriarchal and paternalistic sentencing policies by judges. What I mean by this is that early on, when boys were violent, it would just be viewed as boys being boys. It's okay, it's natural, they'll grow out of it. But if their behavior continued on until age 15, 16, 17, and they're still being violent, then judges might crack down on that behavior. The reverse was seen for girls. For girls, they were being charged with violent offenses earlier because it was really in the eyes of judges, a severe departure from normative expectations of what girls were supposed to do. Girls weren't supposed to be violent. And because they were fighting against not just other people, but against gender norms, judges were more likely to be punitive towards these girls because they viewed them as like the next Eileen Warnos, and because their violent behavior at a young age was so shocking, they needed to come up with a particularly serious punishment for these girls. And that's why we see this discrepancy. Ultimately though, the offending patterns of boys tend to be much more severe than the offending patterns of girls. So boys tend to begin to offend at an earlier age. They tend to offend for a longer period of time compared to girls. They are more likely than girls to continue to offend in adulthood. Girls' offenses tend to involve less serious offenses, whereas boys are more likely to engage in more serious crimes. The vast majority of homicides are perpetrated by boys, but when it comes to homicides against family members, girls are more likely to commit such homicides compared to boys.